We're back on Sports 225, and if I had told you 10 years ago, well, not so much you, but if I had told me and Karl Benson, the commissioner of the Sun Belt Conference, that we'd be together sitting here in Baton Rouge and doing an interview, he'd have said, you're out of your mind, unless you just thought maybe you'd be on vacation checking out some crawfish or something.
Maybe even less than 2 years ago, I might have had a hard time thinking that we'd be here today. But I've been in the state of Louisiana now for exactly 12 months and have adjusted as well as anyone probably can do with moving from Denver to New Orleans.
Now, Karl's a West Coast Rocky Mountains guy. Isn't that the best way to describe it?
It's probably a good way to describe it.
So the Sun Belt Conference now is, and I'll grab the piece of paper later and we'll go over the list of teams, but it truly encompasses the Sun Belt. In basketball and football, you hear a lot of times for a coach taking over a program, oh, he's a West Coast guy or he's a Midwest guy, and the fit and everything. It doesn't necessarily apply to commissioners, does it? Or does it?
Well, sometimes it does. I've been referred to as a Yankee, in the last 12
but you're
months.
Not. I'm a Yankee, Northeast guy,
yeah.
West guy.
West Coast and Yankee, whatever. But my predecessor, Wright Waters, was born and bred, from Alabama and the South, and he kind of portrayed the Southern image. And I think I bring a different culture, a different image, to the Sun Belt, and yet I think I came at a perfect time, Lee, in terms of transition and the changes that were occurring, not just in the Sun Belt, but in the Western Athletic Conference, where I'd spent the last 18 years.
Well, that's why I wanted Karl to come on the show, because there's so much happening in college sports right now, and not the least of which is the ongoing realignment. And there's a tendency to just think of the Big Five conferences and what that means for an ultimate football playoff. But in the second tier, if you will, the movement and the things that are going on are amazing. But since you touched on it, many years ago, I want to say maybe 10, Wright Waters came on the show, came up from New Orleans when he was the Sun Belt commissioner. And it so happened, we had set up the interview, just like you and I did, hey, let's meet on a certain date. It was after University of Miami football team had gotten in a helmet-swinging, all-out brawl that Saturday night with I can't remember who, but nonetheless,
I think it was FIU.
I was going to say that, but anyway, I think you're right. Which is one of your current but leaving conference members. So I got him at a really, really unbelievable time. So how was your first year? You didn't have anything like that.
Well, I had a few suspensions and a few discipline issues, but more than anything, it's been this conference realignment. And in a year's time, since I took over the 1st of April, a year ago, the Sun Belt has added 7 teams and is losing 5. So it's been pretty much a constant membership transition. And yet one of the reasons that I took this job was that the Sun Belt was in a position where it had options. And I knew that there was going to be change, and I knew that there was going to have to be changes made. But I knew that there were a plentiful number of good quality institutions that could fill the holes for the Sun Belt. Unlike, unfortunately, what had occurred out west, that the WAC no longer had the options.
We've got time, and so let me let people get to know you a little bit. So you played baseball in college.
I was a college baseball player, a wannabe professional player that couldn't run, couldn't throw, but I could hit a little bit, and so I made it through 4 years of college. And
no, wait, at Boise State.
At Boise State.
At the same time as a basketball player named
Trent Johnson.
Right, the former LSU coach. Yeah. It's funny how it goes, and because Trent, of course, was in Louisiana and now is in Dallas at TCU. You then coached, right?
I wanted to coach and got into coaching at Boise State after I finished my playing days, and got a taste of coaching and wanted to be a big-time college baseball coach. And spent 2 years at Boise State and then went the junior college route, and spent 7 or 8 years at the junior college level, and figured that I probably wasn't going to make that jump to Arizona State or UCLA or USC, and drifted into administration. Got into administration at the junior college level, and then really what kind of opened the door for this job, the commissioner job, which I've now been since 1990. I've been a commissioner at 3 different conferences now. I went to work at the NCAA in 1985, and that's what opened the door. And actually, back in those days, very few people even could recognize a commissioner. And there were conferences, but there just wasn't the same type of recognition that conferences have today. And in 1990, I became the commissioner.
Part of that's because ESPN was in its infancy.
That's true too. So, but 1990 became the commissioner of the Mid-American Conference, and 4 years later, the commissioner of the Western Athletic Conference, and 18 years there. And
okay, now you glossed over a couple of things. First thing is, what can baseball season early in the year be like in February? It's got to be awful.
In fact, just thinking about it.
Boise's in Idaho, by the way.
But I actually coached in the Seattle area, and it may have been even colder there because of the rain and just the moisture and the humidity in Seattle. But just thinking about it, my feet get cold from those many days in mud and dugouts that that were pretty wet.
Karl Benson is the commissioner of the Sun Belt Conference. He's been there for 1 year. His office is in New Orleans. At the NCAA, now am I right, you were in compliance?
I started out early on. In fact, one of the first compliance positions at the NCAA, and kind of got lucky in that they were looking for someone that had some coaching, some campus experience, and they wanted to try to break the the stigma of the NCAA being just a bunch of lawyers that
they made one day.
they decided to go the coaching route, and I spent 1 year in compliance and realized that that wasn't for me. And a good friend of both of ours, Tom Jernstedt, longtime executive at the NCAA, convinced me to move from compliance to the championships department, which
good call.
That's the fun place to work at the NCAA.
Did you have any juicy cases though? 1985, that was the year Dale Brown got in trouble for calling the NCAA Gestapo bastards.
And it was you can say that, I can't, but it was also the SMU, the era of SMU too.
Ooh,
so
Eric Dickerson and all that,
and the death penalty and such. So it was a juicy time. Dan Beebe, the former commissioner of the Big 12 Conference, was the chief investigator of that whole Southwest Conference debacle and the controversy and the scandal of the Southwest Conference. But got out of that side and went to the fun side of the NCAA, and then followed several of former NCAA staff. Jim Delaney was a former NCAA staffer who became the commissioner of the Ohio Valley and then the Big Ten, and Tom Yeager, the longtime commissioner of the Colonial Athletic Conference, was an NCAA staffer. Dan Beebe, as I mentioned.
Were you guys all together at one time?
I was never there with Jim. Jim left right before I got there. But at one time there were probably a half a dozen Division I commissioners that had NCAA background. And interesting enough, the changes that have occurred in conferences. Back in the 80s and the early 90s, conferences were service organizations, just like the NCAA was a service organization, a governing body that that we put on championships and hired officials and put out press releases and and enforced rules. And it was really in the early 90s that conferences changed into enterprises and became businesses. And I look back on Jim Delaney at the Big Ten and Roy Kramer at the Southeastern Conference, that those two commissioners in the early 90s may have changed the landscape of conference operations to today, as we know, the financial impact that conferences have today on the sporting world.
There are those of us who had made the joke that the SEC has more money than the Vatican. Karl Benson is the commissioner of the Sun Belt Conference. He'll be here for a while. You're watching Sports 225. We'll talk about the Sun Belt when we get back. I'm Lee Feinswag.